Well, AI still needs data, though, right? Without data, the AI is very useless. So our biggest so we sold that data to advertisers, and our biggest customer is actually Google. Yeah, I don't want to. Yeah, there's no practical chance, right? I mean, someone like a Brian Krebs has probably done a really good job protecting himself, right?
What do you expect? They just wanted to make a living.
The data broker just. I mean, I guess there's more than one way. You could.
Again, because they're not making it easy for you to move. Because again, they live and die off of bulk data, right? They want to have as much as possible. They don't want to delete anything. Yeah, I guess we can start.
All right.
Exciting. Paul Mander, thanks very much for joining me today. How are you?
Doing well. Thanks for having me on.
It's New York City. There's always something going on, and I always tell people, well, you had a probably choice of doing something else today. As a busy executive, let me ask you this: were you, when you grew up, you always thought you're going to be a privacy advocate, or is it not? Wasn't it kind of the job description you're looking for?
Definitely not. Growing up, I mean, I had different phases. At first, maybe I thought I would go into politics at some point. I majored in engineering, so thought I would go down that route of being an engineer. I was close, I guess. I have my engineering degree. I've been working in tech, but I've done more, solutions, and now I'm in go-to-market. So everything close to engineering, and certainly that background helps me. But I don't think I foresaw a specific industry necessarily, and definitely not data and privacy. But here we are, and it's a good industry to be in, and I'm glad I'm in it.
Yeah, and I'd like to walk through memory lane specifically, since you have kind of the founder's story and the background in marketing tech. And ad tech as well. So maybe, and it's really, interesting that you also have kind of the engineering background. So you have kind of the know-how of the underlying elements associated with this type of industry, which is the precursor for what we're going to be talking about today.
Mm-hmm.
So talk to me about kind of your earlier roles, how you got into ad tech and what you've been doing and so on. And maybe from there, we will kind of venture into the evolution of that space.
Yeah, well, I began my career in telecom. I was at Verizon for 4 years, got my MBA full-time at the University of Michigan. And then after that is really through a chance conversation at a restaurant, which is probably for a different podcast, landed at a company called BlueKai, which was in ad tech. BlueKai was one of the pioneers of cookie tracking. So this was, the early 2010s, and you can think of, you search for a flight on a site like Kayak, and then suddenly went to other websites, and that you saw the ads for that flight that you searched for. BlueKai was one of the pioneers of that technology. In fact, our biggest, so we sold that data to advertisers, and our biggest customer was actually Google with that data. So I was there for about 4 years working on a solutions team, so really helping our customers implement the technology. And then we got acquired by Oracle, and stayed through that acquisition a bit. But while I was at BlueKai was when I worked with Lawrence Santilello, who's Optery's co-founder and CEO. And he and I have been good friends, stayed in touch. He stayed at Oracle a little longer than I did. I left Oracle for a company called mParticle in the customer data platform space. So rather than data for advertising on the web, this was technology that helped brands centralize the data from all their touch points with their customers, their websites, their mobile apps, in-store, brick and mortar, and so forth. Early employee there, built out a few different functions like support and solutions and sales engineering, and I stayed there for about 8 years or so. And after that, and I was looking for what was next. During that time, Lawrence had started Optery back in 2020. And he, believed in Lawrence and, good friend, and, actually wrote him a check as an investor. Nearly joined as a co-founder, but, it wasn't the right move for me at the time. But, always kind of stayed following along Optery. And then, in 2023, was kind of looking for what's next. And Lawrence had, been talking to Lawrence, and he had mentioned to me that, there's some B2B use cases here in Optery, and I said, hey, that's B2B is what I do. So then I joined Optery in 2023 to lead all of the B2B business here. So I guess the journey was learning how data traverses the internet for things maybe that we don't like, and now taking that knowledge and applying it on the privacy and security side to stop that from happening for folks.
It's fascinating. If you don't mind, I'll double click on a couple of things. First and foremost, the fact that you were kind of almost the pioneer in kind of the cookie realm domain. And the whole idea was at the time is to, and correct me if I'm wrong, was to provide better experience,
Hmm.
right? So it was benign,
Yeah.
the whole cookie thing, and I would say just from personal experience, if you're trying to disable cookies for browsing, we do like private browsing and so on, um, the experience is definitely not there,
Yeah.
uh, because inherently it is made for to ease kind of the friction associated with browsing and having the browser and the company know things about you.
Hmm.
So if you don't mind, talk to me about it in the early days, kind of about what I just described, like what was the cookie all about
Yeah.
and what kind of data was collected, and and when you were working on it, it was completely unknown. People didn't have any
Right.
clue
Right.
that this was even happening behind the scenes, right?
Yeah, it was probably, there were probably people that will disagree with this, especially with those who've been in privacy a long time. But kind of having been on the other side, it was more innocent back then. And here's what I mean by that: so the cookie is basically a text file that sits on the browser, and in that text file is usually an identifier that just identifies it's this browser. And then when a browser arrives on a website, makes a call to the server will then say, "Oh, okay, what's in that text file? Oh, this ID." Then sitting on the server is a bunch of information on it. So back in the BlueKai days, all that information we had was it's a browser. And we didn't even say, oh, you visited these exact websites. We said we just classified your interests. So if you looked at that flight on Kayak, you're interested in travel and for flights and going from somewhere to somewhere else. If you went to some auto website, you're interested in buying an Acura or whatever car you were looking at. And we were actually, and we believe this, and I think we meant this genuinely. We said this is a privacy forward way to do it. And what I mean by that, and this is where some people, I think back then he was like, well, if someone's tracking you, this isn't privacy. What are you talking about, Paul? But, we would never allow any PII in the system. We actually had an SOP where if inadvertently our site code started collecting like a name or an email address or phone number or anything like that, there was like a pager duty chain, like alerts went off. We disabled that code and then went and talked to that customer and said, hey, we're stopping all data
So it was
collection.
supposed to be anonymized
It
at
was,
first.
yeah, it was supposed to be and was entirely anonymized, and that was really the roots of this. And what was the use case? It was two things: one, advertising for sure, and two, like you said, tailoring an experience. I guess things eventually change. It's almost like it's like the gateway drug, right? So you gave marketers and businesses like, here's a better way to advertise. Here's a better way to create experiences, and said, well, okay, I could make it even better if I knew that it was Paul and that Paul had done these things with my brand and done this or done that there, and I can be even more precise with my advertising or with my personalization. And so that's where over the years, it evolved to from, okay, well, sure, the cookie is anonymous, and it mostly still is. Actually, most companies will not put like a name or something in a cookie for their own data security purposes. But then sitting on the server, they've matched that cookie to a bunch of other information that is my name, my address, and my phone number. And now certainly there's a lot of companies like LiveRamp being one of them that will they make a very big business matching like that online behaviors where you're browsing anonymously. You might not be logged in, but through various means, which we can get into if you want, they're able to match that to, okay, that is someone's, Paul with this name, this address, this email, and so forth.
And I think the fundamental problem is that data by itself is, and maybe those data points by itself are harmless, but then once you start connecting the dots with everything else,
Yeah.
then it's becoming iffy or dangerous too, because that can be utilized in certain ways that wasn't the original intent.
Yeah, absolutely right. And so we weren't sitting like Mr. Burns with this master plan that we're going to create this sort of world, right? It was just, oh no, we're going to targeted advertising, better experiences, but certainly the byproduct of that is infrastructure that allows more nefarious things, violating people's privacy and things that you're insinuating.
Yeah, and so in the early days, when did it hit you, or did it, where you kind of figure out, okay, this potentially has a potential to grow into something else? And you're right. It's when you talk to people today, this all it's a bit of an oxymoron. You guys were creating these cookies for tracking,
Hmm.
but you wanted necessarily just to keep it private. Um, was there a moment in time where you understood that this is becoming an issue, or the fact of the matter is kind of it's almost like that movie, where they come across alien life form,
Hmm.
and it's a little tiny thing, you knock your thing, and then all of a sudden it grows into out of proportion. It's almost like that. When he started, it was it was, as you mentioned, it was nothing. It was just meant to be something good. But can you pinpoint where and when did it happen? Like kind of the whole shift in the industry and just personally for you.
Yeah, I guess for me it happened in two phases. So the first was right when I was leaving BlueKai for Oracle for mParticle. I saw that. I said, okay, that advertising stuff is cool, but so I came at it more from the business side than from
Hmm.
the security side. I said, this advertising stuff is cool, but brands have data and they have a relationship, right, with a consumer, and you can do a lot more with that data as a brand, just personalizing experience and less about advertising and selling that data. And that's really the promise of a customer data platform. And this was back in 2011. Sorry, not 2015. They wouldn't even call it customer data platform back then, right? But that's what we were building at mParticle. And I saw that, all right, this technology, it's this advertising thing is not as interesting, and it's the walled gardens were sort of taking over anyway. So I was like, this isn't as interesting. And all right, brands using this data to personalize a customer experience and improve customer service, that's more interesting. So that was maybe the first phase, uh, and that made the shift into customer data platforms. Then while I was there, the second piece was probably when in the EU passed GDPR. And, being from the industry, you're just like, oh, yeah, well, cookies, everyone makes too big of a deal out of cookies. It's not, cookies in and of themselves are not dangerous, which is true. It's like you said, when you combine it with all those other things, right, it becomes dangerous. But when we saw GDPR, and at mParticle, we said, hey, this is a good thing, actually, because we empower brands to, kind of take control of their data. And part of having control of your data is, making sure you're managing it right from a privacy perspective, and GDPR really really forced everyone's hand for that. So seeing that, and really understanding that, okay, there is this backlash, if you will, forming that, hey, there's all this marketplace for data out there, and people really don't have rights, and GDPR was the first really public way of saying, look, privacy is a right, and people have a right to know what data you have out there, and opt out of tracking and get the data deleted. And we certainly developed a bunch of product features that helped our customers with that. But that was the second piece and then you started hearing more about laws in the U.S. And I said, all right, the winds are changing here, and privacy and security are becoming more and more of a thing. And I guess I said two things, maybe the third thing, but the third thing I think I've noticed a bit more since coming to Optery is the unfortunate political polarization of our era. And I'll say it's a global thing. It's not just in the U.S. Now, not having your data private is actually a more of a threat to your physical security. In theory, it was always out there, but now the threat was always out there, right? But now there's enough people that take doxing and harassment to that level where I'm going to publicly dox someone and put their address out there. So I think for me, those key moments, and really what makes me glad to be on this side now, and really doing something good about a problem you could argue that I helped create.
Yeah, well, but that's why you're authority to speak about it, because you got the background. You were kind of on the other side. You're the poacher. Now you're on the other side, protecting the animals. So let me double click on GDPR,
Hmm.
right? I remember when it was launched. First of all, I think there was kind of a shocking, precedence in the industry. The fines were tremendous. I
Hmm.
think it was like 3% of overall revenue, something like
Yep.
that. And then on top of that, it was, almost instrumental. Like to companies had to figure out what to do next, how to. I mean, they had kind of a two year leeway or something where you had a chance to kind of get your things in order. Um, but it was a massive endeavor, right? The right to be forgotten,
Hmm.
right? You have to know where all the data is. It's
Yep.
almost like there's so many fundamental things that are very difficult to control. Um, but in hindsight, looking back, is GDPR really implemented today? And maybe just kind of provide a quick primer for people that are not familiar with it. Do you know what triggered that? Was it the EU just deciding to, were they complaining? Were there incidents? Or what do you think was the fundamental shift towards creating such a, monumental regulatory environment?
Yeah, I think I think there were enough, people complaining for sure. I think they also they have less to lose, and what I mean by that is right. The tech is the biggest driver of the U.S. economy, and it's probably been, you can argue, for the last like 20 years or so, this entire century, that's been the case. And the influence, not to get political, right, but the influence business has over politics is greater in the U.S. than in Europe, right? So with that, there's been less sort of motivation from the government in the U.S. to do
And
something about this.
and Paul, you're referring to lobbyists in Washington, not
Lobbyists
a.
in Washington, right? Yeah, exactly, right there. I'm not saying that that doesn't happen in places like Europe, but certainly the degree to which it influences policy is much lesser, right? That's just a
And we don't
fact.
mind also, like, we're all about business, right? The
Yeah.
velocity of business. So one would argue that putting more compliance inhibits business, right? We're all about, the
Yeah.
U.S. is all about selling,
Right. Yeah.
retail selling, and so if you stop allowing companies to know things about you and tailor
Mhm.
their pitch to you, their product, then you can say kind of the flip side of it is, well, now you're slowing business down. You're making
Right.
it more less effective to reach out to consumers.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. We're more averse to regulation in the U.S. because, yeah, because, like, as you said, right, we are more business focused, more, capitalist driven, whatever phrase you want to use. So I think because that is not similarly the case in Europe, not that people don't want to do business in Europe, right? It's just a different culture. I think, that was, and if you're cynical, you could argue, it's like, well, people say, oh, they're jealous that there's no Google or something in Europe. Maybe, but I think it was more just the people complaining, and combined with that. Okay, yeah, they have, they didn't see, like, oh, there's not gonna be as much of an economic impact. They weren't as concerned about it. Let me put it that way. And I think that's really what led to saying, okay, let's create a framework for this. It's not, we don't want we want to give our citizens a right to say, don't track me, or delete all the data you have about me.
And California created their own CCPA version of GDPR, and I don't know how much that's getting enforced. And how many people do you think even wake up in the morning and say, "Well, I'm going to enforce my right to know where my data is. I'm going
Yeah.
to enforce." I mean, it's minuscule, if not non-existent. I mean, the only thing people care about it maybe the few and far between, privacy advocates, right?
Privacy advocates, and then, I think if you've been a victim of something, right, if you've been a victim of identity theft or doxing or harassment, then it really, it's a wake up call as to, what's out there. So I think those are the folks that do tend to think about it. And then there are some folks who just get awareness of the problem, but I think, to your point, it's still a minority of folks, right? From Optery's perspective, like, it's still a lot of greenfield in this market. For
Yeah, and even if you were, even if you were a victim to some of these consequences, you don't necessarily tie it back to knowing that was data that was used against you in a certain way. You could have just, just figured, okay, well, they got the data from somewhere. Nobody really just connecting the dots. And I believe also that even the administration collects information on
Mhm.
individuals as well. So there's that. Um, so from GDPR and CCPA, how has that evolved? And you would say, okay, if there's all this compliance regulatory environment, the problem solved, right? It's like
Maybe.
there's huge fines,
Yeah.
and now, and it's funny because it doesn't matter. It's in the EU. First of all, a lot of people here in the US are dual citizens, right?
Hmm.
And then on top of that, most of our multinationals organizations, they
Right.
work in Europe. It's not like we're operating in a silo. Supply chain is such that might have partners that are overseas,
Hmm.
and the data you send over, and so it is. is a problem solved, or is how much of an impact does those regulatory environments had on this whole industry?
I don't know if I would say problem solved, because even in Europe, right, there is still a market for data, right? The data brokers, which I'm sure we'll
Hmm.
talk about more later, they still exist and operate in Europe. Certainly when GDPR came to into play, a lot of them shut down, especially the more unscrupulous
Hmm.
ones, right? They shut down, but there is still a market for data in Europe. And so I wouldn't say just the regulation itself is problem solved. I think it's a big component of it. And we're seeing some positive effects from CCPA. There is also maybe a bit of I think there's a bit of apathy though among people. They're like, well, my data's out there and there's nothing I can do about it. So I don't. I kind of just I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and say, just like this is
Well,
just something I have to live
Paul,
with.
the other flip side is they would say, well, I have nothing to hide.
Yeah. Yeah, right, that yeah, like, well, that's what people with specific agendas love to say that, right? It's like, well, if you have nothing to hide, then why do why do you care? And then just when you might have said something or done something that you thought it was okay, and then suddenly it's not okay, just given the winds of society and politics. And then maybe at that moment you're like, oh, maybe I should have thought about
Not even that. It
privacy, or
never goes away.
it never goes away.
You things change. People
Hmm.
live in, go through phases in life,
Hmm.
and things that you've done or sites that you visited, they maybe when you were like younger and had certain political views or whatever the case may be, have things have really changed. Um, and it's amazing because the storage is becoming almost, so cheap that nothing's get deleted.
Right.
And so you can find things that you posted for sale on Craigslist 25 years ago. It's now no longer on Craigslist, but somebody else moved it somewhere else. And so that's a concern. So let's revisit the consequences. And you mentioned that it's becoming not just kind of a just a concern. There are cases where this data was used to for physical harm as
Hmm.
well as political motivation and so on and so on. How did that happen? Maybe, and I think there's always escalation of things. And I'll give you an example in the ransomware world,
Hmm.
right?
Hmm.
It was always just a nuisance
Hmm.
until it wasn't, and then there are cases where you can actually tie it into deaths, right? Or
Hmm.
a
Hmm.
hospital was ransomware, an operation was supposed to be executed, it was conducted, and then because of ransomware, there's no access, and then the patient died.
Hmm.
So there's a clear correlation, escalation between things that happened that were kind of just a nuisance to physical harm. What was the journey there for this particular industry?
Yeah, I mean, I think it helps to step back and talk a little bit about like what we are talking about, right? When we
Hmm.
say this industry.
Yes.
So I think people think, people know, right? It's like, hey, and I think it's true. Google knows everywhere I've been, and Amazon knows everything I purchased, which is certainly
Hmm.
true, right? And they think like that's like data tracking, and that's their notion of it, that is certainly part of it. There's the other piece, which are companies called data brokers, who solely exist for the purposes of procuring and then selling data, right? They make money by selling advertisements and fueled by data. Amazon exists as an e-commerce platform that uses data to really just power everything that they do, right? But they are not fundamentally in this business of selling. They do, Amazon has an advertising platform, so you could say they're sort of selling data there, but they're not saying, oh, here's Paul and here's all the information about Paul. Data brokers, however, do exactly, or like people search sites as an example, right? When I'll say data brokers, like these are people search sites like Spokeo, White Pages, ZoomInfo. Their sole business is selling people's names, addresses, phone numbers, names of relatives, property values, previous addresses, and so forth, right? So kind of making a distinction here. The
And by the way, the industry is huge.
the industry is huge.
I mean, I wanted to double click on it again. Like, it's first of all, there's hundreds of
Yeah,
these, right?
yeah,
we're not talking about five
hmm,
data brokers.
yeah.
How many?
Thousands,
Thousands.
thousands, not hundreds, thousands.
Yes, thousands. And what's the monetary value of like this?
I mean, it
Like,
depends who you ask and who wants to.
yeah,
There's no
yeah.
standard classification. I mean, it's in the hundreds of billions unambiguously. And, someone's like, well, Google's a data bro. I mean, and then you
Hold
can
on.
get to the trillions.
So
But
that comes into the definition of our data is the new gold. right? It's
Or the
new
new
oil,
oil,
yeah.
right? Because it powers everything. I mean, that was such an old saying, but it's still, like I'm like that's 20 years ago we were saying that, but that's
Well, we're
certainly
just
the case.
switching,
So
AI is a
the AI is
new
well,
oil.
AI still needs data though, right? If without data, the AI is very useless. So, but if you think about this landscape that we've painted, I think the average person is more just like, oh my God, Google and Amazon know everything. And they are concerned about that. And I'm sure it's not, doesn't feel nice knowing that, but that's actually not the bigger threat to a person and their physical and their actual life and, and finances and so forth. Uh, Google knows where I've been. Amazon knows what I bought. I might not like it. All right, fine. But that site that has my address and the name of my parents and my spouse and my kids, and that's a bigger threat, right? Because if someone wants to find me and do something bad to me, they can use that as a vector. If they want to steal my identity, they can use that as a vector. So examples of harm, I don't know if I've found examples of like, oh, someone was harmed by Google or Amazon directly, but like, the politicians in Minnesota that were assassinated a few months ago, right? The murderer, the police found a notebook. In the notebook were notes of Spokeo, White Page, a bunch of these data brokers, where he used these data brokers to find out where the politicians lived and then hunt them down.
And when you say they live, this is the amazing piece: is they actually track all your previous,
Addresses as well. Yes.
in which people sometimes use the previous addresses for kind of a reminder how to get your password back and so on. So there's a lot to it. And what kind of data? So you mentioned the addresses, you mentioned the relatives, but there's also more than that. There's like criminal records, like they aggregate almost everything. And
Yes.
so talk to me about kind of the type of data that can potentially be found in one of these brokers.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned so they will aggregate is the key word. So like let's take a criminal record. That is technically public record, right? It's not something that's so easily accessible. Like the government doesn't, and maybe it varies by state, right? But there's not a simple way. It's like, oh, let me just go to this website and find every criminal, and it's so very easy to obtain. You sometimes you have to fill out a form, do a request.
So security by obscurity was kind of it's a thing, right?
Yeah.
So almost like privacy by obscurity, meaning the data was there, but you had to make an effort,
Correct.
a concerned effort to go out there and sometimes physically show up at the police station or whatever, fill out forms. But that also kind of went away.
Make a FOIA request
Right.
or whatever that is.
Right.
So the data brokers, what they do is that we will do that, right? But once they do that, then they'll make that data on the website, get it indexed by Google and so forth, and now suddenly there is no obscurity, like you said, right? It's there for everyone, and what they'll do is now if we go back to the cookie, well, that's where they'll combine different, use different data points to create this whole picture. It's like, all right, so here's a criminal record we know about this person. Maybe the criminal record didn't have, the newest address for that person. I'm not directly familiar with what's on a criminal record, right? But let's say it had an address at the time, and now you've moved on and you're somewhere else. Well, the data broker will then know that, all right, so they've got the criminal record, they've got your name there. Maybe then you go to some website that has a relationship with the data broker. You fill out a form that has your name and your address and maybe like an email, and the data broker has tracking on that site. Then they'll say, okay, I've grabbed that information. I'll go look that up in this data that I purchased or whatever, procured from the government, and say, oh, this is the same person. So now they've got this profile that has my current address, current phone number, email address, and my criminal record as well. So that's just one example, right? Or the extreme example is
even family members.
family members. Yeah.
And so, and how much money do they make? I mean, if you said the industry is so large, like meaning they monitor, the total addressable market is in billions of dollars. How many of these requests are they? Like, what are we? Everybody, are you just spying on everybody? Is like, how does that work?
There are legitimate use cases for data brokers, right? So these are things like recruiting. If you want to hire someone, you want to find out how to contact them. This existed before the internet, right? Mailing lists, right? 70s, 80s, people mailing catalogs, and there were a few set of data brokers where you would just buy a bunch of addresses and to do bulk mailing, right? The difference now is just with everything technology, the scale and distribution is just way more vast. So people have been buying this data really just for advertising type purposes, but the thing is that now it's just available, and there's not really any framework to say who is or is not allowed to buy this sort of data. So there's always a preview of it for free, right? If you Google yourself and you don't use any sort of service to get your data out of these data brokers, eventually you'll get after a few pages, you'll find these results where you don't have to buy anything from the data broker. They just have a preview of like, oh, here's Paul, and here's where he lives, and here's his phone number, and so forth.
Yeah, because even as you mentioned, it's not even that expensive. I don't know how much it is. It's
Well, it's free, right?
Yeah,
That example is free,
yeah.
right? And if you have ill intentions toward one person, you don't need to buy a list of thousands from a data broker, right? There, and we've seen that the assassin who did that. You mentioned cyber, right? Black Bassa, the ransomware gang, they were hacked, and their Slack logs were leaked, and in their Slack chats, they mentioned like, oh yeah, we use a data broker called Apollo to research companies and who they should target for ransomware attacks at companies. So I don't know if they may be purchasing from there or not. I don't remember, but they don't have to though. Like I said, you can just do a search and find a specific person's information.
And some would say information wants to be free, right? So if there wasn't for these aggregators, the information will still be there, but it would just be less accessible. So maybe that's not so bad. Maybe it's just the fact of the matter. Okay, somebody will have to just go out and do a little bit more work. And if you're a nosy neighbor, instead of just Googling your neighbor, you can just go out and have to do some work, right? So maybe this whole I would say the kind of devil's advocate would say, well, what do you expect? They just wanted to make a living.
The data brokers just.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess there's more than one way. You could someone who robs a store because they don't have food. They don't have money to buy food. Well, they just wanted to eat a meal. I mean, right? Does that change the legality?
If there are thousands, it's got to be lucrative business and barriers to entry. So talk to me about like if I wanted to create a data broker tomorrow, because maybe that's what I should do. Maybe I should kind of work both sides of the fence, right?
That'll kill your cyber credibility, but sure.
Well, I do it under some synthetic identity. But all joking aside, if I wanted to create one, right? Is there moats? Like, do I have to go out there and spend a lot of infrastructure? I want to also take the leap into AI and how easy it is to use AI scrapers and do the correlation piece. I think that all that used to be more complicated, but you can probably go out there and create almost an app that does all the collection and as well as the aggregation and the dissection of all that. What does it take for me to do one? And maybe not. We shouldn't provide the whole recipe, but I just want to paint a picture of why there's so many thousands of these, and why and whether it's so easy or hard to create one.
Yeah, I guess you got to start with what data do you want, and then how how to obtain it. And
do they collaborate? These
I wouldn't say they collaborate, but what happens ultimately is that there's a shell company of a shell company of a shell company, and like actually 10 of them are owned by the same company. They just have different branding, right? And if the one gets shut down for some reason, they just put their data into another one. So I wouldn't say they collaborate, but there's we said there's thousands, and if you take all the brands of them, then maybe it gets into tens of thousands. But,
wow.
Yeah.
And who is doing it? Because I in my mind I would think about it, somebody wearing a floor shirt, living in overseas in some sort of resort-like environment where
Maybe.
They log in and they have a team of people that outsource overseas that does some of the kind of the computing work. But or is it like nation state, or is it government sponsored? Like, who is behind this type of broker?
I think the picture you painted, and certainly there's probably ones like that are traced back to some sort of person who is running a bunch of scams or whatever you can say. But there's also legit, like ZoomInfo is a publicly traded company running a legitimate business, and they will honor opt-out requests, right? And they want to do things right. by all the frameworks and stuff in place. So it runs a gamut from what you described to a well-run, publicly traded, transparent, organization.
And the data is being collected. You mentioned something that you have the ability to not just request for that data to be deleted, but also what if there's errors in there, things that were just like a credit report, right? When you go in and there's some things that you know are incorrect. Are these companies? Can you do that? I mean, I've seen some cases because I'm a client of Optery, where they do provide you the ability to do that, but it's huge, cumbersome. It's almost have to be a full-time job to go out there and do that.
I would ask, why would you want to correct this data
Well,
about you?
but
Right?
let's say ZoomInfo, like let's say, or where some, as you mentioned, it has a legitimate reason. Maybe like if you're applying for a job and they do some background check on you. Okay, so
No,
maybe that's
ZoomInfo is not the place you would go for. I struggle to find a legitimate reason you as a consumer would want your data to be accurate in those. And if anything, the motivation for them to be accurate is very low, right? They want scale. So we've seen examples. So let's take I obviously haven't seen your data, right? But there's David Raviv, and there's an entry about you out there, and then there's Dave Raviv if you ever went by Dave. A data broker, we've seen this like oh, those are two different people, even though maybe the addresses are the same, the phone numbers are the same. Oh, those are two different people, or D. Raviv, or that's three different people, right? They're not motivated for it to be accurate. They want the scale. They want to sell as much data as possible. So we
so
certainly
they'll charge you for each record. Is that what you're
yeah,
saying?
many of them do.
Okay.
Many of them will charge based on how many records. Something they all have different types of business models. So their motivation for it to be accurate is not there. And certainly as a consumer, I would argue that it's better for you that it's inaccurate, right? Because someone wants to find you, then they're going to be chasing going to the wrong place or texting the wrong number.
So it's like poisoning. I'll give an example with AI, right? So there was a project that was embedding wrong information into JPEGs, where the AI that will scan these will get kind of the wrong information, so we can regenerate. And so in this particular case, as you mentioned, maybe there's a place, for you to kind of spoil that data so it's inaccurate, so it doesn't lead back to you or has your wrong information.
Well, there's no. You mentioned, there is it's hard to correct your entries, and I mean that's certainly not the business we're looking to be in. Spoiling is that's why people create sort of burner email addresses or get a virtual address and so forth. Like that's sort of spoiling the data for them, right? It's like, oh, if you want to find me, and it leads you to like a PO box or some virtual address or something like that, or this email address that I use to burner email address, and I never use my real name when creating accounts tied to this email address, right? Those are kind of the ways consumers can go ahead and do that. You can argue there's a so level of an efficacy to that because, as we kind of mentioned before, the data brokers will go to legitimate data sources that may not be totally accessible to everyone and get that. Like, oh, let's get all the phishing licenses, and for your phishing license, you use your actual name and address, or right. So that's one way to do it. Would I say it's foolproof? Definitely not.
And coming back to the collection associated with it, it's I'll give an example. If you move, right, if you move physical location, you move an apartment or house, it's remarkable how quickly that address gets aggregated. And I'm just, sometimes I think to myself, who did I give this address to? Was it USPS? Is USPS selling my, is somebody within USPS is on the keyboard? I'm being paranoid about this, but it's remarkable because it did happen to me within 2 weeks of changing address. My new address was already available out online, and I'm just thinking, like, who else did I give this address? Not a lot. Maybe the power company when I changed, and then the address to do the kind of redirect the mail. That's about it. And who else knew about it? I mean, maybe a T-Mobile, I don't know, or Verizon.
Yeah, it is amazing how quickly it happens, and if that's one I certainly don't know the answer to. But you're right. When you move you do notify the postal service, and then you get all these offers for like moving services or other things, right? So maybe somewhere in there,
Even on the
one of those
website, I think USPS, when
yeah.
you do the change of address, it, within, and again, it's a complete revenue source. Within, I think after you go through the questionnaires,
Hmm.
there's a section where it's no longer USPS, but they almost don't let you know about it. It's almost like a third party now,
Yeah.
where like they offer you all these services. How quickly these things get
Yeah.
distributed. How do they these data brokers? Where do they get this information? Does it just scrape, or they have different sources? How does that work?
Yeah, scraping is certainly one. Getting it from legitimate sources, hidden in some agreement of some app you might have downloaded at some point is that we sell your we will share your data with partner. They won't literally say we sell your data to someone, right? They'll have say we share your data with other
Yeah,
partners and so
there's a
forth.
saying: if you don't know how you're paying for it, you are the product,
You are the product. Yeah,
right?
yeah,
And so we know. So let's kind of the underlying, I guess, assumption is that it's very, very difficult if you wanted to protect yourself. Like there's almost no chance, even if you use like burner emails, your data is still out there. So let's talk a bit about
yeah. I
that.
don't want to. Yeah, there's no practical chance, right? I mean, someone like a Brian Krebs has probably done a really good job
Yeah.
protecting himself, right? But I think that when he's a couple miles from his house, he puts his phone in a Faraday cage, and right. So practically, but he has reason to do that, right? Because he has a bit of a target on his back from some, really potentially scary people, but. So putting that aside and that level of security aside,
Or paranoia.
yeah, or yeah, I mean, you could. I think for him, it's probably rightful. But yeah, maybe for me and
Well,
you,
paranoia keeps you alive, right?
paranoia keeps you alive. Yeah,
Yeah.
right. But practically speaking, for most of us, like to put that much effort into it, it's just not something we're going to do.
So that leads me to the next question. You can potentially just do it on your own, right?
Hmm.
There's, if you find let's say you Google your name and the first 20 data brokers come up. You can go in there and manually request your data to be removed, right? I mean, I'm assuming some of these companies
Hmm.
have that.
Yes.
So first and foremost, is it correct where for example, when you do a domain search,
Hmm.
when you're looking to register domain, there used to be companies, and sometimes they even advertise now safe domain search, meaning as soon as you're searching for it, they will register that domain, so
Hmm.
then they will be able to sell it back to you at a higher cost. Is there kind of the same concept that you are searching for yourself? You're making a request, or the fact that you search yourself, all of a sudden you're kind of waking up the fact that somebody's looking for your name and somebody's looking for your records.
I haven't seen that happen necessarily with people, just because it's not a very it's a bit of a different data signal,
Mm-hmm.
right? When you're searching for a domain, that company can infer that, okay, well, there's a reason why you don't just search for domains, but searching for people, there's so many different reasons people have for it. So,
But maybe when you're
but
requesting removal,
yeah, but
they'll say, okay, this person is keen on getting, maybe now we'll, as you mentioned, there's a lot of shell companies. Maybe we'll now advertise the next 9. So we'll pretend that we're removing from here. But now it's like, we if you want to remove the next 9, is going to have to pay premium.
yeah, I get what you're saying. The economic motivation though for the data brokers isn't like their economic motivation is just get as much data out
Scale.
there as possible and scale and
Scale.
right. So whatever I need to be doing to get more profiles, I'm doing that regardless of if someone is searching for a profile or not.
Right. And so talk to me a bit about how difficult it is if I want to manually do this, because I want to make sure that people listening here
Mm-hmm.
understand. So we talked about the scale.
Mm-hmm.
We talked about like how it's everywhere. We talked about how current it is and connecting the dots and all that. And then now let's talk a bit about how, if somebody's concerned about this, if aside from signing up,
Mm-hmm.
how difficult, how easy it is to just clean it up yourself.
Yeah. So the first is you need to know where your data is, right? what are the data brokers out there? We actually have a resource for people, the Optery Data Broker Directory. It's the largest open source directory of data brokers where we list all these data brokers as well as how to opt out. So you need to find all these data brokers. Then you need to go conduct searches. So these are thousands of sites. Then you need to search all of these sites. Not all of them are publicly searchable, by the way, right? But you need to search those sites for your information, confirm that it's there, then ascertain what is the process to opt out. Some of them have email, some help desk, some of them have a web form, some of them have, I don't know, mail a request somewhere. Actually, just yesterday, there's an article, I think it was in Wired, that a lot of the data brokers have forms to opt out, but they've actually been having search engines not index those web pages just to make it harder to find. It was an article just came out yesterday, I believe, about that, right? So that's hundreds and hundreds.
And do they have to fax these? I mean, I'm assuming some of them have that kind of.
I'm sure some of them do. Yeah, we have. We're not doing faxes on behalf of our customers, but but they'll have things like, they'll have like, okay, then you submit up the form, and then they need to do like an SMS verification of a phone number. So so then at that point you would expose your phone number to them even if they didn't have it, right? So there's a or like we need to do an email verification. Well, if they didn't have your email,
It's
now
almost
they need
like
to expose your email. But
they tell you when sometimes then you get a spam email and it says opt out, do not click on it,
right,
because that will signal that there's a live person on the other side. So in this case, like the process of removing yourself can potentially exposing you for another. Basically take that information and now they use to authenticate you that you are the one who owns that data.
Yeah.
And then they can say, turn around and sell it to somebody else, like another another company. As you mentioned, there's 10 companies of the same owner or the same company.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there's companies competitive to Optery that they actually, how they get people's data, as they just blast an opt-out request without checking if your data's there. We don't like that approach. There's certain data brokers where you have to do that because they don't let you search. But we if you can search and then verify, we always do that before. But and it's exactly because of what you said. If they didn't know that I existed, well, saying, hey, I'm Paul Mander and I live here and please opt me out. Well, now I'm Paul Mander and I live here.
And so, but it's possible, right? I mean,
it's possible.
If you're retired and that's your life goal.
Yeah, if you want to sit on the internet and maybe with agentic AI, it can be a little faster, but you still need to know where to send the AI to do it. And
do they require by law to provide that opt out?
Depends where you live. Right, if you have a state that has privacy laws, or if you're a citizen of the EU, then yes. But in many cases, they're not.
And even then, like, what are you going to do? Sue them? Like, I mean, that,
right.
Like, what do you?
Yeah, you could, right. You could submit a complaint to your, if you have a privacy law in your state, you can submit a complaint to your state attorney general or the FTC or something like that. But,
go ahead and do that. It's like, you're getting a spam call, right?
Right.
Go ahead and file a complaint.
Yeah.
Let me see you go ahead and spend the time. And if you're a busy individual or not even busy, you just don't have the time of day to go ahead and do that. And so we now know that the process is difficult, if not impossible, to get all your stuff. And it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole, no?
It is.
Like you take one and it's five others show up, right?
Yeah, exactly. We see this in Optery too. Like the number of data brokers, we're always adding support for more, but sometimes it goes down because this one went out of business, this one rebranded, and then they suddenly popped up at some new company. It used to be these guys. It's So it is definitely a game.
Do you guys create a dashboard of almost like, it'd be interesting to see like how like the over time and maybe geographical location and so on. That'd be interesting to see where.
Yeah, we should. We actually have that data. We know like where we profiled where the data brokers are. We should probably add that to our directory.
And do you have a list of like like these are the top 10 offenders? These are innocuous, like they're not as bad as you mentioned. There's some legitimate ones, but then you have. And I'm sure it's the Pareto principle, like the 80-20, like 80 of them are kind of, 80% are kind of okay. You have 20% who are really nefarious. Mm-hmm. Is that the case?
Yeah, we have a concept, and after we call them dishonorable data brokers, where basically they just refuse to honor opt-out requests at all.
Even though they have it in their...
Yes, even though they have the
so what,
data.
What kind of what do they say? They just, we don't want to do it, or just come up with some excuses.
Yeah, or they will just not respond, or they will say no. We will not honor this request. They just they that's kind of it. the nope. So yeah, so in those cases, that is we actually do engage with the FTC. We engage in with states' attorney generals, and for us, because we have a level of scale, sometimes we're able to make some better progress than an individual could on their own.
And even then, I'm sure it's not something that happens overnight.
Right.
The wheels of justice are very slow. It might take you 18 months to even get like to that broker. And as you mentioned, it's so easy to just close down the LLC and open up a new one, and then all you have to move all the data and move all you off to the races. Like it's not, it's a never ending, cat and mouse kind of thing, right?
Yeah, and the other way it's never ending too is that an opt-out request is not infinite, right? So even written into CCPA, it says that the opt-out is valid for 365 days. You can guess what the data broker does on day 366. It brings back the profile, and in places where you don't have a law like that, I've seen like my data come back after about a quarter or so. So we're constantly scanning for and checking to see if the data is there.
Mm-hmm. And in terms of the process you have, let's talk about Optery, like how you guys do that, because again, I've tried it before. Like I'm currently a premium user for that. You have an automated process, and then you have kind of the kind of bespoke version. So let's talk about the automated process and how you perfected that, because that allows you for kind of the 90% of the offenders, right? How to you go through and first you discover where they are. That's the number one problem, right?
Right.
Maybe talk to me about that technology, and then we kind of move on to like, what do you do then?
Yeah. So the discovery part is important. We've essentially, what you could say, built a very specialized search engine that's able to find the data at these data brokers, and that's really important because for a few reasons, right? Mainly, like, let's just take an example. Let's say your name is John Smith. And you live in New York City. So the most common name in the U.S. and the most populous city in the U.S. So if I just search for John Smith, New York City, I'm going to get tens and tens of thousands of results. So, John Smith, and then we'll say, okay, then we get a year of birth, right? So in Optery, we design our platform to minimize the amount of data you have to give us. You can give us more, and that'll help us find your data faster and for sure. But it's your name, your current city, current state, and your year of birth. So if I say John Smith, New York City, with this year of birth, now I've narrowed it down, right? So basically, we'll use whatever data you have to find your profile, and then once when that happens, actually in our platform, we'll give you screenshots and links to the data that we found. So we don't just say like, trust us.
And why is that important? Just so the user can validate that this, what you actually found is legitimate. Like it's something that's
exactly right. And that's we make a very big deal about that, because this whole data broker space is really a shady black box. So if we're trying to solve this problem, for us to behave like a black box, it's just not right. That's not right. You should expect transparency from a service. So yeah, it is super important. And so those results will come back, and you'll see in the platform, here's exactly what we found. And as I mentioned before, we're constantly scanning, right? So as we, we'll get those results back, and then we'll submit opt-out requests, and we can, get into like how exactly that works. But as we see the results, and our platform actually learns of that, okay, this is the right John Smith, because I always see this John Smith with maybe this other person living in the address, or this other phone number. This phone number is always there, even if you didn't give us that phone number. So that search and matching is a super important process. But yeah, once that searching and matching happens, we have the results.
And how quickly do you find like a new broker that just popped up with your data? Like when they say continuous, like what does that look like? Once a week? Like how does that?
Yeah, we're actually constantly scanning. Like we sort of guarantee that we'll hit every data broker we cover once a month. But our processes are always constantly running, checking some site out there for customers' data.
The first thing when I onboarded, I was shocked to see how many. Like again, because if you're not in this industry, like you're not where
right.
It's hundreds, and then the number just kept going. Like it was the first, I think within a week, I saw a couple hundreds,
Yeah.
and then a number kept going. And then it's almost like the tail end of a removal
Hmm.
piece, some of the removal, but then you have more and more that
Yep.
are added,
Yep.
to the back end of it.
Yeah.
So it's almost like, first in, first out, like kind of thing where
Yep.
we're constantly remove. So let's talk a bit about the removal piece and how it's get automated, because you overcome a major problem. Meaning, first of all, they're all different from what it is that requires to be opted out.
Hmm.
And so, how did you automate that piece? And then maybe we'll kind of walk through the kind of the bespoke section of it.
Yeah, totally. So essentially we built automations that will fill out these web forms. So if the data broker has a web form where you fill out the needed information to get your opt out, that's what's automated. The other automations we have, so the example we mentioned before, that say someone needs, some data broker says, well, you need to click this email verification or an SMS verification. So what our platform will do is we'll spin up a disposable phone number on behalf of our customer to verify that SMS for the opt out, or to spin up a disposable email to verify the opt out. That way we don't expose our customers'
So that's
information.
super cool. Like I got to tell you,
Yeah.
that's was it something you built? Was it always a feature in the platform, or was it something you built because of out of necessity?
It was always the intention to
Yeah.
to do that, right? I mean, when we first built the platform, we, like you pick the easy ones, the ones that some data brokers have easier processes, some
So it wasn't in
harder
the
ones.
MVP. That's
Yeah,
what
it
you're
wasn't
saying.
in the MVP for sure, but it was always the plan to have that, right? Because that's what we were, the conversation you and I had earlier was what we were thinking. So, well, if they don't have my data, why would I want to show my email address? Like that's doing our
Or
customers a
or even
disservice.
worse, text like your phone number.
Yeah, yeah, exactly right, exactly right. And within those, right, there's things to get around like Cloudflare and verify, like solve captchas on behalf, right, to do that all automated so that a person doesn't have to get involved.
Yeah, I was about to say that there's probably some mechanism that they're trying to stop you from
Hmm.
automating,
Yeah.
again, because they're not making it easy for you to
Hmm.
remove because again they live and die off of bulk
Yeah.
data, right? They want to have as much as
Yeah.
possible. They don't want to delete anything.
Yeah, the military metaphors never stop here. It is an arms race. So think of all those ticket scalpers that buy all the concert tickets before anyone else can, right? And they have essentially an army of bots, and sites like Ticketmaster, they do their best to try to stop them and put all these messages, things in place. The data brokers are actually kind of doing the same thing, and we're actually using the same sort of methodologies that the ticket scalpers are using, except we're using it for good, right? So it's an arms race in that sense.
So you are starting to leverage technology like like the large language models. I'm assuming like LLMs to better fill out these forms. I'm assuming, and also because again they may modify, as you mentioned, they may modify the requirements.
Mm-hmm.
And so, are you leveraging AI like for to get better in terms of the mechanism and how you remove them?
Yeah, so we've been leveraging AI before it was cool, actually. So let's take that John Smith example. So minimum data required in Optery. Let's say you never put that phone number in, but as we are scanning and we keep seeing that, all right, that okay, there's some data brokers that'll have your name, your address, and your phone number. Some might just have your name and your phone number, right, and all permutations and combinations of that. Our platform, and this has been the case for years before LLMs were a thing, because we're not using an LLM for this. We're using machine learning, but the platform will learn like, okay, well, I always see John Smith and this phone number is there, and it's happened this many times. Okay, I can safely assume that this is the person I'm looking
Yeah.
for. So if I just see this phone number, and I'm going to assume that it's that person.
Yeah,
So
and
the
it's amazing.
platform learns.
Yeah, like a fuzzy logic kind
Yeah.
of thing where and we do that as well.
Hmm.
That's what humans are very good
Yeah.
at. We kind of know,
Yeah.
and because we've seen this before, and we kind of learn,
Hmm.
and so that process is becoming more effective. So you mentioned as the search is ongoing, and particularly looking for your information, the platform will become more and more accurate and be able
Yes.
to be aware of more and more incident. And maybe that's why my data was becoming, were found more and more data brokers, because it was maybe a permutation of my name, and then the platform was able to now detect, was like, hey, this was not quite me, but now they know it's me, right?
Yeah.
Because of the combination of the name or phone number or whatever the
Yeah,
case may be. Right?
that certainly could be the case, right? And it was good to have that features. There's a lot of people, we don't do anything with data, right? We're not selling here. There's no secret business. This is the thing we're here to do. But still, people might say, oh, I still want to give Optery all the data, right? If you gave us everything up front, we're gonna remove it faster for sure because we don't need to train the robots, right? But yeah, for you that it could have been some of that. Of course, we add support for more data brokers for sure. So it might have been we didn't support that, but now we do support that. So of course we
Do
found
you
your
look
data
at
there.
different languages? I mean, I'm assuming there's data brokers all over the world with the kind of various type of geographical location.
Not yet. We definitely, international expansion is something that we're working on right now. We're in the U.S. and we're about to launch in a couple of other places, but still searching English only. But probably in the next couple of years or so, we definitely want to expand.
And so that is good for what? What's the percentage of these data brokers that you can kind of automate this process? And then walk me through the other, percentage point and what do you do?
Oh, the manual, yeah. I would say the vast majority are, I would say almost like 60-70% you can. The manual, yeah, there's sometimes where there is like an email interaction required. So in that case, we do have a team, what we call privacy agents, who again will spin up a disposable email on our customer's behalf and do any sort of communication or escalation of a request. So there are certain data brokers where they are manual processes. That's why we always say
Do they know you already? Do they know Optery? Like, do they recognize that it's not the actual individual, but it's the company doing it on behalf?
Some do and some don't. Obviously we're all not fans of data brokers, but they're not. A lot of them are legitimate businesses that want to process things, right? So we actually have API integrations into them. They're using a company like a OneTrust who does consent management offers a set of APIs, and data brokers actually use that to process their opt-out requests. So our platform will talk to them via API, as an example. So there are some that require manual. We have privacy agents to do that, and then we also have what we call for our ultimate plan custom removals, where look, we know we don't support every single data broker out there. So if you find your data out there somewhere, you can actually enter it to the platform, and we'll make a best effort to get it removed. And that's actually, as people do that actually, we'll learn how to do an opt-out at that, and that really just helps us, get that as a fully supported data broker, if you will, via custom removal. But yeah, so we'll have our privacy agents just do that.
And what if you wanted the next level up, like a target team, saying maybe you're an executive and say, I know that somebody's after me specifically or my family, and you guys are experts in that. That's all that you guys do. And I want maybe kind of a little bit more hands-on. Would you be able to offer something like that? Or
We can and we do for we have some very people you've heard of that are in the news that are customers of Optery, and we do that sort of thing. It's one of, I think people like this idea that oh, you're a VIP and you'll have someone there and we will have someone there. The reality is it doesn't really make that much of a difference, right? If the data's out there, an opt-out request has been submitted, I guess you can say that, hey, there's an active threat against this person. Please hurry up. A lot of the data brokers
you
kind of
notify
don't
the
care.
police and they knock on the door or wherever,
Yeah. Notifying the police, it's what about the data broker?
Yeah, yeah. They show up.
Their data broker's not doing anything illegal.
No, but let's say they don't want to take it out. How there's always a means if there's there's always a means to do extra, right? So you'll send somebody over to kind of say, hey, if you don't take these, take this off, I'll, show up with a baseball bat.
I would say good luck with that, right? So I guess you have to find the police, and sometimes a lot of these are they're based in Russia, so you contact the Moscow Police Department and see how far that gets you.
Yeah, maybe you'll have agents in each country that will be able to physically go out there. It's remarkable. It's almost like a whole underlying, industry that kind of popped up. But again, if you follow the money, right? There's money to be made, right?
There's money to be made.
So that process is available as well, like for the ultimate version of it. So I want to make sure before we before we part ways, I want to make sure that we cover why this matters, not just for individuals, but also for companies.
Yeah.
So companies spend a lot of time and effort to review their security posture from the bits and bytes, how they look like from the outside world. Everything's secure. They have firewalls, application firewalls, and so on and so on. And then they do the same, or trying to do the same for supply chain as well, right? So they kind of the extended attack surface, if you wish. But then one would argue that the extended attack surface is the individuals, the people that work with these companies.
Yep.
And they don't have firewalls, and they have a mobile phone, and they're actually quite vulnerable, right? The human element associated with, so with AI, or not even with AI, with phishing, I would say that a phishing campaign or a phishing campaign starts with data collection. Right?
Yes.
And it starts with data collection, and where the data resides is data brokers. So talk to me about where this industry is going from that perspective.
Yeah, I think you hit on it. The notion of the attack surface is changing. So you're right. A phishing, any social engineering campaign begins with data collection. So how do I start one? Well, first I got to know where you work. Well, LinkedIn, that's very easy. Second, I got to know how to contact you. And that's where, and everyone's like, oh my God, dark web and this and that. It takes a level of effort to access the dark web, right? You need Tor, you need some level of sophistication, or you go to this data broker website where you just need to search Google, or now you can just create a agentic AI to just, quickly.
I would say that it doesn't really matter where it is. It can be the dark web, but which is minuscule in the size of the.
And you also really can't do anything about it either.
Right,
Dark
but
web, right?
if you find it in the surface web or like a paste bin website, you don't care about it. Of course you do. It doesn't really matter where the data reside. But it's you mentioned the path of least resistance. Where can I find it?
Exactly, right. So these data brokers are the path of least resistance. So
and they can do it in bulk.
And
they can take the whole company.
Yes. You can just map out the organization, right? And like AI just is like increasing the speed at which they can do this. So, so companies have all these things to, you've got all this infrastructure to, block phishing attempts, and you've got training and so forth. But really, this is like, we're talking to companies, let's play offense. You can actually do something to not just be reactive and say, oh, the training, I'm going to spot this phishing email. You can do something to reduce, and we've seen customers, we've got verified data with our customers, to reduce the number of incoming social engineering attempts. And that is remove this data from data broker websites from your employees. So the notion of the attack surface is not just, my endpoints and my infrastructure from the traditional technical sense. It's this data that's sitting there on these data broker websites, because each of those is a vector for a social engineering attack. So I find all of those, and then I remediate all of those. That then you're playing offense. You're making it that much harder for someone to initiate a social engineering attack against you. And those are the conversations that me and my team on the B2B side of Optery are having with CISOs every day.
And that's where the industry is going as a whole, like from a cybersecurity perspective and risk. The industry is moving to left of boom. They're trying to preempt, what's it? An ounce ounce of cure, or
ounce of prevention beats a pound of cure. Yeah,
that's the kind of thing, and it's very effective, right? So meaning, how do you kind of quantify the ROI associated with with doing that? I'm assuming you kind of put together some sort of a matrix when you're talking to these
within our platform. You can see exactly how many scans we did, how many removals we did, what type of data we've removed, and we can integrate that into your SOC as well. We have an API for that. And the other way is actually partnering with our customers. We worked with one CISO of a bank and looked at, all right, for the employees that they were protected with Optery, the amount of quarantined spam. And I think he saw it was almost like a 40% reduction in quarantined spam for the employees that were protected.
That's incredible amount.
Optery. Yeah.
Because again, you don't necessarily. I mean, those statistics are amazing, but it's what you care about is the one that gets through, and it's a malicious email with a payload that does get through, and despite all the security awareness training and all that, somebody clicks on it, and then kind of the kill chain starts to proliferate, right? That's what you care about. So a 40% reduction is just another way to kind of reduce that chances of the whole attack chain to even start to proliferate, right?
Yeah, exactly right. You need the whole program. You still need the reactive defensive things like your anti-malware and right then the training, but this is the proactive. And to your point, yeah, like if you reduce that by 40%, then that one there's the lesser percentage of a lesser pie, is potentially getting through.
And and this is all be done kind of behind the scenes, so meaning that there's not a lot of taxing on the employee themselves. Meaning this is just you guys do your thing in the back end,
Yeah,
right?
they just fill out their profile like a consumer, which takes 5 minutes. And for executives and such, they might have their EA do it for them or something like that. But yeah, it's set and forget. Most of our business customers, the people we're protecting, probably rarely log into our platform, much less than our consumers, frankly. There's some who will, and and we appreciate them and like that they're very privacy forward. But yeah, we're in the background doing our thing.
And you mentioned that sounds like you're enterprise ready. You have connectors to the SOC and some other,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe potentially other reporting, like if they use some other platforms. Does the reporting, is it individual, or is it, can you do a reporting for the entire company and showcase like what is currently being done for them?
Either or both. We're very focused for like the company level reporting. We won't put individuals' personal data in that reporting, right? And just for protecting like the individual's privacy. But at the company level, across the entire company, how many emails we found, how many phone numbers we found, and so forth. And we can say we found this many emails for this individual, but we will not reveal here are the emails we found or here are the phone numbers we found for this individual.
And what's the engagement look like? Meaning, did it start with? Can you start with like a fraction of the employee? Can you like onboard them gradually? Maybe like talk to me. Like, is there a proof of concept?
Yeah.
What does that look like?
Yeah,
From that
we
regards?
do. A lot of times we do. I mean, there's companies with customers we had where they put the whole company in at once, and others where we do a more of a crawl, walk, run. Usually it starts with protecting the executives, and that's usually what people are aware of. I think this bigger notion that you and I have been talking about is something. It's starting to come into play more and more. Executives have always been protected because they're public facing, the doxing threat, and so forth. But we'll work with our customers and do like a risk assessment to say, okay, well, we're saying we're going to prevent social engineering and phishing, which is the leading cause of a data breach. Okay, which employees, if breached, carry the most risk if their credentials were breached, right? So we'll say it would be like engineers with access to source code for a tech company, or it could be for a healthcare company like caseworkers and so forth, HR team members, or other things that are maybe not as much about a data breach. Finance team members, right? There was that guy that sent a bunch of fake invoices to Meta and Google and got millions of dollars paid and eventually got caught and he's now in jail, right? But those are phishing attempts sent to the finance team with fake invoices going to that person's bank account, right? So finance team members are also a big one. So we'll identify, which are those employees and sort of, stage, deploy the rollout in phases. We can move really quickly, or we can kind of, crawl, walk, run with our customers. Often it's also, fitting into the budget and that sort of thing. But yeah, that's usually how we approach it. Of course, I want to protect everyone, but we'll look at like, all right, what are the priorities and where do they get the most bang for the
And
buck?
speaking of priorities, who is it for? So you mentioned financials. Of course, they're always kind of the leading. They have a lot to lose. I would say everybody's got a lot to lose, right? Who you would say is currently kind of the best, kind of best fit customer kind of thing?
I mean, really anyone, but yeah, we have more like financial services and healthcare, and I think that's really just because of the financial and reputational costs of breaches is much higher in those verticals. Also, the regulations around protecting data, and then also a lot of like government and nonprofits. That's less about cyber and more the unfortunate political polarization and people becoming targets. So protecting folks from doxing, so we have court systems. We have like nonprofit groups, ones that you've certainly like heard of and know of. That's maybe like the other group of customers, and I said less about cybersecurity and more about their physical security.
In the category of removal, right? Like of what you guys do specifically, they're taking care of that. There are other players, right? Excuse me. There are other players, meaning that is becoming, is becoming. First of all, it's great, right? It means that there's a need for that.
Yeah.
But you guys have a unique approach. Maybe maybe define what kind of the one or two, three things that makes Optery like unique in its approach and its its mission and so on.
Yeah, I think the first is we're the only platform out there that will show you what data we found and offer you proof that it was removed. None of our competitors do that. And as I mentioned earlier, like you can't be a black box amongst this, shady industry of black boxes, right? So for us, and we have a patent on this whole system that will do the search and provide the results in this manner. I think in that way, that's probably the biggest, the biggest differentiator between us and our competitors. And I think the second one is, we are really the most tech forward approach to this problem amongst our competitive set, and that that allows us to do this much faster. You said you signed up. When you sign up with Optery, within minutes you'll see removals. Minutes of you signing up, and you see it right in our user interface, and no one else can do that. Those are really the two things I think that is our proof that we don't just say trust us. We show you that we're doing our job, and if something's not working, you will see it and contact us, and we'll fix it. And the second is really a tech forward approach, backed up by humans for sure, but a tech forward approach.
And it sounds like too, like the other piece is the enterprise. The fact that you've kind of established the need for it, and then you adapt it to the enterprise need. It's one thing to do reporting and dashboard and removal from one individual.
Yeah.
But once you start to scale, there's certain needs are associated with doing that for for a larger company, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I guess that's where the roots of I was selling data infrastructure to company for enterprises for 10, 15 years or something like that. And now I'm going to sell
removal.
Yeah, now I was like, hey, all that stuff. Now we're going to fix all that now.
Yeah, removal is cooler actually.
I really I love Optera. I really enjoy what I do, and very, very blessed and glad to be doing something that I'm helping enterprises. But this is one of those things where, if a company says, I'm going to sign up an employee for Optera, it's also good for the employee, right? All the personal benefits of identity theft protection and stuff the employee gets. So, it's good to be doing something. It feels really good to be doing something.
Yeah, and it's much better to just, to work on something that's proactive as opposed to, every time there's a breach, you get these identity theft protection.
Yeah.
But then you end up having 4 or 5 of these simultaneously. Yeah. But it doesn't necessarily matter already because your data has already been leaked. It's better to work on it prior to this happening. Couple questions, and then this has been great. One is, you mentioned you're already having conversation with executives in these companies, right? How aware are they? Is this in the radar screen? When you show them some of the data, I'm pretty sure you come over and you show them, and it's even more important to show them with their own data.
Yep.
What's the feedback you get? What's the conversation you're having with inside these boardrooms?
Yeah, you're right. When we encourage, cause when even in business was like, try it, and then let's put some of your executives in there, and they'll get to see, and when you see that. I tell you that your name and address is out on the internet. You're like, yeah, I know. But then when you actually see it on a website, then it's just like, whoa, oh my God, and it has my spouse's name next to it. So, certainly they see it for themselves. And I think the conversation is that there's general awareness. I think they see the degree to which it's a problem. But then I think the bigger conversation is like, hey, it's not just enough to protect your executives, and here's why. If you look at, all these data breaches, I struggle to find one where they breach an exec. It's always someone lower down in the org chart. And why is that? Probably because execs have all this protection. Execs are also too busy. Execs never answer email, right? We've all worked with execs, and getting them to answer emails is always hard. Well, I guess that also helps because they're also not, looking at the phishing attacks and so forth. So, right, with the MGM data breach, it was like an employee way lower in the food chain that was social engineered. So the conversations we're having with the boardrooms is like, hey, you need to protect more than just your execs, and here's why. It's because of this, and it's because of this playing, this mentality shift to play offense against social engineering, and you have to do it now because we haven't talked a lot about AI, and this is my first podcast in a while. There's no AI. I kind of find it refreshing, right? But AI just makes this problem more acute because the threat actors can formulate their attack. They can pick their targets much faster, formulate their attacks faster, and then the actual contents of their attacks, right, can be that much more believable.
But they still need the content.
They still
to train the AI to
Yeah.
write a bespoke email
Yes.
still requires all that information to be entered.
Exactly. So, if you have to start playing offense now because the wave of threats is just going to be increasing. So you keep doing what you're doing, but you need to add this relatively low cost compared to the other things that you're doing into your cybersecurity program.
Yeah, and if it's if you can show effectiveness and efficacy, like it speaks volume in terms of like just the amount of reduction in the kind of attack surface, and that's what you are. You're minimizing the attack surface available for the entire organization, which is, I would say, people always say, like in cybersecurity, what's the weakest link, right? It's between the keyboard and the chair,
Yep.
right? We humans
never change.
that never change, and then now it just makes it a little difficult to find out information. So the last question is, like, I want to talk about a bigger picture, like the future of privacy, right? Where things are going. I mean, it seems like we were kind of, as you mentioned, we went from the inception of the cookie, things went kind of downhill, and now with the apps and the phones and privacy is out the window. We're constantly being monitored. And then captured, and as you mentioned, it's all captured. The issue is the connecting the dots, and the fact it's sits somewhere centralized, and it's easily accessible. Is this problem is going to get bigger and bigger, and then it's going to fall off the cliff because we're going to solve it somehow, or is it in your opinion, is an expert in space, where is things going?
I mean, I think what's needed is how to empower people more. And there's a couple ways to do that. I mean, one obviously would be some legislation and so forth. And we're all for it. We believe privacy is a right here at Optery. So that's one piece. And the other piece is how else can you empower consumers to have control of where their data goes? Optery, we remove data, right? But like, how can you empower consumers to say, hey, I actually don't want my data going somewhere in the first place? And I think for privacy really to become a thing, is solutions like that help with that part of the problem. Is like saying, the supply, right? Like the demand for that data is still always going to be there. So like, how do we further, we're cutting off the supply, but all right, if there's a demand, maybe as a consumer, I can say like, I'll send my data here, but not here. So I think solutions that maybe empower consumers to control where the data goes, that's probably where, that could be really big.
In individuals, everybody has something to lose. I mean, the notion is that we have nothing to hide, or the fact that the data is, kind of apathy of around like, well, my data is already there. There's nothing I can do about it. Well, there is something you can do about it, as you mentioned, right? And that, should be a concern, right? Where we're still, the fact of the matter is, like, you don't want your data somewhere that you don't have, completely no control over, right? Good stuff. Looking forward to seeing where you guys go next. Looking forward to engaging in these conversations. And last but not least, what's the easiest way to get in touch? Give it a test run and know more.
Yeah, go to www.optery.com. As a consumer, you can just sign up, and for free, we'll do a scan, and you can see exactly what data you have on you. And on the business side, you could create an account for your organization. You can purchase Optery without talking to the sales team, or if you want some help, want to learn more, there's forms right there on the site to talk to us, and we're pretty quick in getting back to people. Or you can find me on LinkedIn, linkedin.com/Paul Mander. I'm always posting and talking about this stuff, and feel free to reach out to me there. And I appreciate you having me on.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Paul. I'm looking forward to see where you guys go next. And for all those who watched, highly encourage. Again, I'm a user. I'm a customer. I've been using Optery for quite some time, and my data is still out there, unfortunately. But we're making a dent, and we're moving in the right direction. So for all those who joined, thank you very much, and stay safe until then, and see you soon.